Welcome to Stairway to English. Today, we will discover the life of Ludwig van Beethoven, one of the greatest composers in history. Listen and read along to practice your English and get inspired by his amazing story. Episode 1: Beethoven's Early Life and First Steps in Music. Ludwig van Beethoven is one of the most famous composers in the history of music. His name is known all over the world, and his music is played in concerts, movies, and even in schools. But Beethoven's life was not an easy one. He faced many struggles, both personal and professional. Still, he never gave up. His story is not only about music, but also about strength, courage, and hope. In the series, we will learn about the life of Beethoven in detail. We will see how a boy from a small town became one of the greatest musicians in history, even though he had to face one of the hardest challenges for a musician, losing his hearing. Beethoven was born in December 1770 in Bonn, a city in present-day Germany. His exact birth date is not completely certain, but he was baptized on December 17, so his birth is usually celebrated on December 16. His family was not very rich. His grandfather, also named Ludwig, was a respected musician in Bonn, but his father, Johann van Beethoven, was less successful. Johann worked as a singer at the court of the Elector of Cologne, but he struggled with alcohol and was not always responsible. Johann wanted young Ludwig to become a musical child prodigy like Mozart, who was already famous in Europe. He forced his son to practice the piano and violin for long hours every day. Sometimes, Beethoven was even taken out of bed at night to practice. It was a hard childhood, and Ludwig often felt unhappy. However, the strict training helped him to develop strong musical skills at a very young age. By the age of 7, Beethoven gave his first public performance. People noticed his talent, but he did not become a child star like Mozart. Instead, his journey to success was slower. Around the age of 11, Beethoven left school and began working as an assistant to the court organist. He was very skilled at playing the organ, piano, and violin. He also started composing small pieces of music. When Beethoven was a teenager, he met important teachers who helped him develop. One of them was Christian Gottlob Neef, the court organist. Neef quickly saw Beethoven's genius and introduced him to the works of great composers like Bach and Mozart. With Neef's support, Beethoven published his first piece of music at the age of 12. It was a set of keyboard variations, which showed his early creativity. Despite his talent, Beethoven's life was still difficult. His father continued to drink heavily, and the family often had money problems. When Beethoven's mother, Maria Magdalena, died in 1787, his life became even harder. She had been a kind and supportive person, and Beethoven loved her deeply. After her death, Ludwig took on more responsibility for his younger brothers, especially because his father was unreliable. In 1787, Beethoven traveled to Vienna, the capital of music in Europe, hoping to meet Mozart and study with him. Some stories say that Beethoven played for Mozart and Mozart was impressed. However, Beethoven soon had to return to Bonn because of his mother's illness, and he never had the chance to study with Mozart. This was a big disappointment, but he continued to work hard in Bonn. During his years in Bonn, Beethoven became part of a group of young intellectuals who loved art, music, and politics. He was influenced by the ideas of the Enlightenment, which believed in freedom, reason, and human rights. These ideas stayed with him all his life and influenced his music later. In 1792, When he was 21 years old, Beethoven finally returned to Vienna. This time, he stayed. He studied with Joseph Haydn, one of the greatest composers at the time. Vienna was full of rich nobles who supported young artists, and Beethoven quickly became known as a brilliant pianist. His powerful and emotional playing amazed everyone. The first part of Beethoven's story shows us a young man full of talent and energy, but also facing many struggles. His strict father, his family's problems, and his personal losses shaped him into a strong person. Music was not only his talent, but also his way of surviving and expressing his deepest feelings. In the next part, we will learn about how Beethoven began his career in Vienna and how he quickly became one of the most admired musicians in the city. Episode 2: Beethoven's Struggles and His Rising Fame. Ludwig van Beethoven's life was never easy. Even in his younger years, he had to face many difficulties. But these struggles shaped him and made him strong. In Vienna, where he moved to study music, Beethoven quickly became famous for his amazing piano playing. His style was powerful, emotional, and very different from others. Many people in Vienna were used to music that was light and pretty, but Beethoven's music went deeper. He played the piano with such force and passion that listeners felt as if he was telling them a story through sound. At first, Beethoven was seen as a great pianist rather than a great composer. People wanted to hear him play in private homes, at concerts, and in gatherings of the rich. He often surprised his audience by improvising, which means creating music on the spot. He could sit at the piano and invent something completely new, full of energy and emotion. This made him stand out from other musicians. Vienna was full of talent, but Beethoven's fiery personality and bold style captured attention. However, behind this rising fame, Beethoven was already facing a terrible problem. In his late 20s, he began to notice something unusual. Sounds were becoming less clear. Conversations were harder to understand. At first, he tried to ignore it, but slowly he realized the truth. He was going deaf. For a musician, losing hearing is the worst thing that can happen. Imagine painting without being able to see, or writing without knowing the alphabet. Beethoven was terrified. He did not want anyone to know about his problem because he feared people would stop respecting him as a musician. This secret made his life very heavy. Beethoven loved people, but he also argued with them often. He had a strong temper, and many found him difficult to deal with. Now, with his hearing loss, he sometimes avoided friends and gatherings. He did not want them to discover his weakness. Yet, even in this darkness, his music continued to grow. In fact, many believe that his struggle with deafness pushed him to create music that was more powerful, more emotional, and more honest than before. One of Beethoven's most famous works during this time was his Symphony No. 2. It was full of life, energy, and even humor, even though Beethoven himself was in deep pain about his hearing. This showed his incredible ability to turn personal suffering into art. People who listened to his symphonies often felt inspired. They heard strength, courage, and the spirit of fighting against life's difficulties. Beethoven's career as a composer started to shine brighter. He began to write more symphonies, sonatas, and concertos. His music was no longer just entertainment for the rich. It became something that touched everyone. Even ordinary people who had never studied music could feel the passion inside his compositions. He was changing the way people thought about music. It was no longer background sound at parties. It was something that carried meaning, something that could make you think, cry, or feel strong. Still, Beethoven's health and personal struggles were very real. He often felt lonely. He wrote letters where he confessed his sadness and despair about losing his hearing. But even in his darkest moments, he did not give up on music. He once wrote in a letter that art held him back from ending his own life. His purpose was to share music with the world, and this mission gave him strength to continue. By the beginning of the 19th century, Beethoven was not just another musician in Vienna. He was becoming the leading composer of his time. Young musicians looked up to him, and audiences waited eagerly for his new works. He brought something new, music that was not just beautiful, but also full of deep human feelings. He showed that music could express struggle, hope, anger, and joy. Beethoven's rising fame and personal struggles show us something important. Greatness often comes with pain. His hearing loss, which could have ended his career, instead pushed him to write music that changed the world. His journey teaches us that even in the darkest times, human creativity and spirit can rise above difficulty. This was the period where Beethoven's name became known not only in Vienna, but across Europe. His performances, his strong character, and his bold new compositions made him unforgettable. Even though he was slowly losing one of his most important senses, he refused to stop. Instead, he transformed his struggle into music that continues to inspire people hundreds of years later. Episode 3. Beethoven's Silent Battle. By the early 1800s, Ludwig van Beethoven had become one of the most respected composers in Europe. His symphonies, sonatas, and concertos were being performed in Vienna and beyond. People admired his genius, his energy, and his originality. But behind all this success, Beethoven was fighting a very private battle, his growing deafness. At first, the problem was small. He could still hear the piano and understand most conversations. But slowly, the silence inside him grew stronger. Voices became unclear, music lost its brightness, and everyday sounds began to disappear. Beethoven, who had once lived through sound, now felt as if he was being locked in a world without it. This was his silent battle, and it would last for the rest of his life. Beethoven tried many treatments. He visited doctors, used ear trumpets, and followed strange medical advice. Some told him to bathe in cold water, others suggested herbal medicines. None of it worked. The more he tried, the more he realized that his hearing was never going to return. For a musician, this was a tragedy. Imagine a bird that cannot fly or a writer who cannot read. Beethoven feared that people would laugh at him, or worse, forget him. In 1802, he went to a small village outside Vienna called Heiligenstadt. There, he wrote a famous letter to his brothers, known today as the Heiligenstadt Testament. In this letter, Beethoven admitted his deep sadness. He wrote that he had thought about ending his life because of his deafness, but he also said that his art kept him alive. He believed he had more music to give the world, and this gave him the strength to go on. This letter shows us the pain he carried, but also his incredible courage. Even as silence grew around him, Beethoven's music became louder in spirit. He began to write works that were larger, more powerful, and more emotional than anything he had done before. His Symphony No. 3, called the Aurorica, is one of the best examples. Originally, he dedicated it to Napoleon Bonaparte, whom he admired as a hero of freedom. But when Napoleon declared himself emperor, Beethoven tore up the dedication in anger. He renamed the symphony Eroica, meaning heroic, and it became a symbol of human strength and struggle. This was music that broke rules. It was longer, more complex, and more dramatic than any symphony before it. Beethoven's silent battle made him both difficult and brilliant. He often shouted at friends, not because he was angry, but because he could not hear his own voice. He avoided parties and gatherings because conversations were too hard to follow. Yet, when he sat at his desk to compose, he entered a world of sound that existed only in his mind. He did not need to hear the notes with his ears. He could hear them in his imagination. This ability is what made his later works so extraordinary. Despite his suffering, Beethoven was not without joy. He loved nature deeply. Long walks in the countryside gave him peace. He often carried paper and pencils with him, writing down musical ideas while walking in the forests and fields around Vienna. For him, the sound of birds, the wind in the trees, and the flowing of rivers all became part of his inspiration. Even as his ears failed him, nature spoke to him in ways beyond sound. During this time, Beethoven also faced money problems and unstable relationships. He never married, though he loved deeply and often. His letters reveal a sensitive man who longed for connection, but also pushed people away with his strong personality. Some called him rude, others saw his heart. But no matter what, his music showed the world his true soul. Beethoven's silent battle was not just about deafness. It was about facing despair and finding hope. It was about fighting the fear of being forgotten and replacing it with the courage to leave something eternal behind. His music from this period is often described as revolutionary because it changed what people thought music could do. It was not just sound. It was human struggle written in notes. By the end of this period, Beethoven's deafness was severe. He had to use notebooks where friends would write down conversations for him to read, yet he continued to compose, creating masterpieces that still inspire people today. His silent world did not stop his creativity. In fact, it may have made his creativity stronger. Beethoven's story in these years teaches us something important. We all face silent battles, struggles that other people cannot see. But these battles do not have to destroy us. Like Beethoven, we can use them to build something greater, to create beauty, and to inspire others. His courage in the face of silence is one of the reasons why his music continues to live on more than 200 years later. Episode 4: Triumph in Silence. By the second decade of the 1800s, Beethoven was almost completely deaf. He could no longer hear the applause of his audiences. He could not hear the conversations of his friends. Music, for him, was now something that lived only in his imagination. And yet these years were the most creative years of his life. In silence, Beethoven wrote some of the greatest works in history. One of the most famous moments of his career came in 1824, when his Ninth Symphony was performed in Vienna. This work was unlike anything the world had ever seen before. It was not just an instrumental symphony. In the final movement, Beethoven added singers and a choir. They sang the poem Ode to Joy, written by Friedrich Schiller. The words spoke of brotherhood, freedom, and hope. Beethoven, unable to hear his own music, had created a piece that celebrated the unity of all humankind. At the first performance of the Ninth Symphony, the audience was filled with excitement. People had heard about Beethoven's struggles, and they admired his strength. When the music ended, the hall erupted in cheers. But Beethoven stood with his back to the crowd, unable to hear a single sound. A singer gently turned him around so that he could see the people clapping and waving. Only then did he realize the impact of his music. It was one of the most moving scenes in music history, a deaf man leading the world in song. The Ninth Symphony was not the only triumph of these years. Beethoven also wrote the Missa Solemnis, a grand religious mass filled with deep emotion. He created his last piano sonatas, which are now seen as windows into his soul. These works were more than music. They were journeys into the heart of a man who had suffered but never given up. Every note showed his determination, his passion, and his humanity. Beethoven's music during this time was different from his earlier works. It was more personal, more spiritual, and more complex. Some people in Vienna did not understand it at first. They found it strange and difficult. But over time, musicians and listeners realized that Beethoven was pointing toward the future. He was opening doors to new possibilities in music. Composers who came after him, such as Brahms, Wagner, and even modern musicians, were influenced by his bold ideas. Although his music was triumphant, his personal life was filled with problems. He lived in messy apartments, often moving from one place to another. He argued with landlords, friends, and even family. His health was weak, and he often felt lonely. One of his biggest struggles was with his nephew, Karl. Beethoven had taken responsibility for the boy after the death of his father. He wanted to raise him with discipline and love, but the relationship was full of conflict. Karl, tired of his uncle's strict rules, once even attempted to end his own life. This event brought Beethoven much sorrow. Despite these hardships, Beethoven never stopped working. Music was his lifeline. He woke up early, wrote for hours, and took long walks to gather new ideas. His notebooks were filled with sketches, corrections, and experiments. Sometimes a single melody would stay in his head for years before he completed it. His perfectionism was legendary. He wanted every note to express exactly what he felt. In his final years, Beethoven also became more philosophical. He thought deeply about life, death, and the human spirit. His Ninth Symphony, with its message of universal brotherhood, was not just music. It was his gift to humanity. He wanted people to believe in joy, unity, and hope, even in the face of suffering. As his health declined, Beethoven knew his time was limited, but he did not fear death. Instead, he saw his music as something that would live forever. He once said, "There is nothing higher than to approach the divine." For him, music was that divine path. Beethoven's triumph in silence shows us that true strength is not about avoiding pain. It is about transforming pain into something meaningful. He could have given up when his hearing disappeared. He could have lived in bitterness. But instead, he created works that continue to inspire people all over the world. His story reminds us that greatness is not measured by comfort or ease, but by resilience and creativity. When we listen to Beethoven's late works today, we are hearing more than music. We are hearing the voice of a man who overcame silence. We are hearing the echo of courage, the sound of hope, and the triumph of the human spirit. Episode 5: The Legacy of a Genius. In the last years of his life, Ludwig van Beethoven's health grew weaker. He suffered from stomach pain, liver problems, and many other illnesses. He was often in bed, unable to move easily. His friends worried about him, but he tried to stay strong. Even when his body was failing, his mind was still full of music. He continued to compose as much as he could, writing down ideas in his sketchbooks until he no longer had the strength to hold a pen. By 1826, Beethoven was very sick. He stayed with his brother for a while, but the cold and damp conditions made him worse. In December of that year, he returned to Vienna. Doctors tried to help him, but there was little they could do. In March 1827, Beethoven's health collapsed completely. On March 26, 1827, he passed away at the age of 56. The news of his death spread quickly through Vienna. People were deeply saddened. Beethoven was not just another composer. He was a symbol of human struggle and victory. Thousands of people came to his funeral. It is said that nearly 20,000 people filled the streets to pay their respects. Writers, musicians, and ordinary citizens all gathered to honor the man who had given them so much through his music. It was one of the largest funerals Vienna had ever seen. Even after his death, Beethoven's music continued to grow in importance. His works were performed across Europe and beyond. Musicians studied his scores, learning from his bold style and emotional power. Young composers looked up to him as a guide. His influence reached Franz Schubert, who died just 1 year after Beethoven, as well as Johannes Brahms, Richard Wagner, and many others. The world of music had been changed forever by his genius. One of the most remarkable things about Beethoven's legacy is that it is universal. His music speaks to people of all cultures, languages, and times. The Ode to Joy from his Ninth Symphony is now more than just music. It is used as a symbol of peace and unity. The European Union chose it as its official anthem. It has been played at world events, celebrations, and even protests, reminding people of the hope for freedom and brotherhood. Beethoven also left a message for future generations about strength and perseverance. His life was not easy. He faced poverty, loneliness, illness, and the loss of his hearing. Many people in his situation would have stopped creating. But Beethoven continued. He turned his suffering into beauty. He showed that limitations can become sources of power. This is why people often call him not only a musical genius, but also a hero of the human spirit. Today, Beethoven's works are performed in concert halls around the world. His symphonies, sonatas, and string quartets are studied by musicians, loved by listeners, and admired by scholars. Young piano students often play his simpler pieces, like For Elise, while professional orchestras bring to life his great masterpieces. His music is alive centuries after he wrote it. But Beethoven's story is not just about music. It is about courage. It is about never giving up. It is about believing that even in silence, one can create a voice strong enough to move the world. This is why his name is remembered not only by musicians, but also by anyone who seeks inspiration. Beethoven once wrote in his notes, "Music is a higher revelation than all wisdom and philosophy." For him, music was not entertainment. It was a way to connect with something eternal, something beyond the struggles of daily life. This belief gave his works a power that still touches hearts today. As we look back at his life, we see a man who began as a young prodigy in Bonn, who rose to fame in Vienna, who battled against fate, and who triumphed in silence. His journey was full of pain, but also full of greatness. Beethoven's story is proof that art can transform suffering into hope, and that one person's vision can inspire millions. The legacy of Beethoven is clear. His notes still echo in concert halls, in classrooms, in films, and in the minds of listeners everywhere. His courage continues to inspire people facing their own struggles. His music reminds us that joy, freedom, and unity are possible, even in the darkest times. Beethoven may have left this world in 1827, but his spirit remains alive in every performance of his music. He showed us what it means to fight against despair and to create beauty from pain. That is why, nearly 200 years later, we still celebrate him as one of the greatest geniuses the world has ever known.